let's start with the why. Why write this piece?
Because on December 14th, I watched, as did many others here in Louisiana and across the nation, I watched the Heisman Trophy ceremony. And what I saw that night, I found to be very moving. I was amazed to see Joe Burrow show himself the way he did, a guy who is generally a stoic, showing that vulnerability, showing that emotion, showing that humility, showing all of these pieces, crying the way he did, showing the connection he had with Coach O that was so obvious and so powerful. And I was watching with Leslie, my wife, and we were both intrigued by that. We were both very moved by it. And it was Leslie's idea. She said, you've got to write about these guys. I kind of laughed it off. Well, plenty of people were writing about Coach O and Joe Burrow. They didn't need another tired old writer to be doing another story. But the more I thought about it, I realized these guys were in a special place. Anyone with a beating heart could see the connection between those two men, what they meant to each other. But I had never really seen anything done on what got them to that place. So that was what I wanted to explore. And I nibbled around for a little bit for a week or so and learned enough to decide that it was really worth exploring. And that's exactly what I did the last few months.
So from December the 14th to now, that process obviously was very extensive. We talked about a few weeks back, Jeff, that's what led you to snap the now very famous photograph of Joe Burrow with the cigar post-game national championship while you were there. So this is sort of the fruit of all of that labor leading up. Let's go back, though, through some of the process of getting to now to publishing the piece. So you decide, all right, I'm going to write this story on Ed Orgeron and Joe Burrow. What were your sort of preconceived notions going in that maybe were challenged as you went through this process?
Well, I learned a lot about Joe, and I learned a lot about Coach O, but even more than that, the relationship and the way certain things had been talked about. For example, from that speech where Joe talked about Coach O handing over the keys to the program. Well, that's an easy thing to say. I think it is symbolic, and we can all kind of make our own conclusions about what that means. But I really learned that they weren't actual keys that he handed over, but my goodness, he practically made him a member of the coaching staff. And it was really, that was one of the pieces that was very interesting for me to learn about. We had also heard a lot about the mutual trust and respect, but I don't think we knew a whole lot about how that developed. And so as I was exploring those pieces, I learned a lot about things that had been portrayed one way as they were playing out, and there was maybe a few different angles on some of those sequences along the way that I was able to learn about that really showed us where that mutual trust and respect came from. So I would say those would be some of the pieces.
I know we got you for two segments, so I'm going to get into some of the particulars of the piece, but I still want to kind of create some of the framework here. It's 17,000 words. Can you please put into perspective for our audience who maybe doesn't know how to conceptualize what that means for a writer? How much is 17,000 words?
Well, the easy answer is it's a lot. You
Yeah.
notice that I kind of laughed a little when you asked because it's even ludicrous to me. But generally, as you know, I write books. And to put it in perspective from a book, the last book I did, Walking with Tigers, a collection of LSU sports stories, that was about almost 90,000 words. A book that I still spend a lot of time with, working with different groups around the country, called Season of Life. That one was about 60,000 words. So there's quite a range there. But if you think of 60,000 to 90,000, which is kind of where my books fall into, somewhere in there, 17,000 is a pretty good chunk of that. So that's a little bit unusual. In fact, extremely unusual, I should say, for anything that's going to appear in a publication such as a newspaper or even a magazine nowadays. So, yeah, it's real long. That's why we broke it into 3 parts. I give a lot of credit to the Advocate and Perrin Keys, the sports editor over there, for making this work and getting that up in the fashion that he did on their website. And I'm really pleased with the way it looks and how they've handled it. And I think by doing it over 3 days, we can reach a lot of people, and hopefully they'll be able to make it through the length of those stories.
Thank goodness for the digital format, because it allows for things like this, which is fantastic. How many people did you talk to throughout this process?
Well, talk to, I couldn't tell you, but actual interviews. So, when you're doing a project in depth such as this, you talk to a lot of people just for a fact here, a fact there, checking something or tracking something down. I don't know how many people I talked to, but I do know I actually interviewed 35 people. And some of them were multiple times over a few months. So Dan Burrow, Coach O calls him his MVP. One of Joe's brothers, Dan, Coach O calls him the MVP of the recruiting process. I call Dan the MVP of my research and writing process. I told Dan it would be a pain in the neck when we started, and I think I proved that to him very well along the way. He was really unbelievably kind and generous with his time, and I was very fortunate that he and others, the Burrow parents as well, Jimmy and Robin and Coach O and so many others. A lot of the players were incredibly helpful. Derek Panansky, Jack Marucci, Michael Bonnet, even the governor, John Bell Edwards, and Chris Fowler from ESPN. I mean, it kind of went all over the place because there were different pieces I wanted to explore.
I think if for those listening, and Jeffrey Marx is our guest, he's on Twitter at LSU Tigers Book. Make sure you're following Jeff on Twitter. You're kind of getting the sense now, if you're listening, that this is the most in-depth piece that anybody's done, certainly on Ed Orgeron and Joe Burrow and their relationship. The first installment is up at theadvocate.com right now on their sports section, so make sure that you go read it if you haven't. I ask you this every time, and then we'll break. We'll come back. I want to talk about some of the meat and potatoes of the story. When I ask you this every time we do something along these lines, Jeff, and you know that everything can't make it into the story. There's always things that end up on the chopping room floor. What's something that maybe you didn't get to explore, or that you did explore that didn't make it into the piece that you thought or maybe hoped could have?
Yeah, I think it's some of the people I interviewed, I would say it's their individual stories. So I'm going to give you an example. Bunny Cannon, one of the daughters of Billy Cannon, she was very helpful, and we spoke several times during this process. Her story with her relationship with the Burrow family as it developed is just a beautiful story. And I could have done thousands of words just on that. In fact, I kind of tucked that away and thinking maybe somewhere down the road I would do something with her more in depth. But for this piece, just a couple hundred words, part of a scene. Governor John Bell Edwards, same thing. I really only needed him for 5 or 10 minutes to check a few things with him that I was interested in related to the Heisman speech because he was there. We ended up talking for half an hour because he was just incredible. He was so close to the program, knew so much about it, had a lot he wanted to share about Coach O and about Joe Burrow. That would be another example where I could have done 1,000, 1,500 words just on that. But you just can't do that. Some of the players as well. Clyde Edwards, Elaire, Thaddeus Moss, probably Joe's two best friends on the team. They were both incredible. I could do a whole story just on the friendship of those three guys. Great stuff from them, all on the cutting room floor. So you just have to pick and choose and hope that you can tell the narrative in a way that people will enjoy it and will also be representative of their journey.
Glad to be visiting with our good friend Jeff Marx. He's on Twitter at LSU Tigers Book. He wrote the most in-depth profile of Joe Burrow and Ed Orgeron that has been written. It's 17,000 words. It's split up into 3 different installments. Part 1 is published right now at theadvocate.com, titled The Story of Joe Burrow and Ed Orgeron, Forever Linked. Part 1, which published today, Jeff, is more the recruiting process and how Joe Burrow came to be an LSU Tiger. If there's one thing that surprised me most, it was how convinced Ed Orgeron and Kelly Orgeron were that Joe Burrow was not going to be an LSU Tiger. I'm curious your sense interviewing all of them and with knowing what we know in hindsight, what it was like hearing them tell those stories of their recollection of a time when it seemed like Joe Burrow was not coming to Baton Rouge.
Yeah, so the Orgerons were not alone in that thought, I can assure you that. Foster Morrow, who was the player host for Joe's visit, same exact thing, thought there's no way the guy's coming here. Pretty much anyone I talked to, and I didn't know anything about that until I started talking to people for this story. So that was pretty interesting to me and how that all unfolded. I think it says a lot about Joe, as he says, a guy with a self-described poker face type of guy, a stoic. So he just wasn't showing a lot of his thought or his feeling. He was staying quite quiet during his visit, and that was really a concern, I think, to the LSU folks. They didn't think that was going real well at all. But actually, the part about that visit that stood out the most to me, we've heard so much about the night where they ate the crawfish over there at Mike Anderson's, and that's been a fun story for everyone to share. Guy from Ohio coming down having crawfish with all the folks from Louisiana. showing them, a little down home feel of the food here. But that wasn't really the part of that night that stood out the most to Coach O when we talked. He shared with me a story, I call it the parking lot conversation, and he feels like it was really the turning point, the start of trust, as he says. So that night, the Saturday night of Joe's weekend visit, is when they were at Mike Anderson's for the crawfish. And on the way out, Coach O had the absolute feeling that Joe wasn't coming. And he knew he needed to do something to change the dynamics. So they had a conversation in the parking lot that night on their way out. Everyone else kind of went off in other directions, and it was just Coach O and Joe alone standing in the parking lot on a Saturday night. And Coach O shared a lot with him in detail about what his vision was and what Joe's role would be here. And I didn't know anything about that. How would we know anything about that? I don't think either one of them had talked about that before. But Coach O told me that was probably the single most important conversation of his entire career in coaching, which tells you a lot right there.
I think given what we know now with the benefit of hindsight, it's safe to say if that's what got Joe Burrow to here to Baton Rouge, that's not an overstatement. The other really interesting thing, and people who read today's installment will see the text messages between Dan Burrow and Ed Orgeron. So did you get those from Dan or from Ed or from both?
I got those from Dan, but in my conversations with Dan, the agreement that I offered to him was I wouldn't use any of that unless I talked to Coach O about that so that he would know, too, that Dan had shared those with me, and was it okay with him if I used those? And it was fine with both of them. So they came from Dan, but they were both totally comfortable with those being used. And I always love stuff like that because it's real. It's the goal is I wasn't there for any of this stuff. When you're not there for a story and you're not able to observe it yourself, it really turns into a story of research. You need to recreate scenes. You need to recreate communications. Nowadays, fortunately, there's so much that's available. And, text messaging is one of those tools you can use quite often if the folks are willing to share some of that with you. So there was nothing in there that, the goal would never be to embarrass or to show anything that shouldn't have been shown. But I thought it really was symbolic. It gave a great feel for what their communications really were in real time.
And how much Ed identified Dan as the guy in his corner to really push Joe. And we also learned, Jeff, that Dan Burrow loves exclamation points in his text messages. I think that's one thing we definitively learned.
Right. That is something I was able to tease Dan about, and we had a couple good laughs about that. I've never seen a guy use so many exclamation points in his texting, but yeah, that definitely was funny to see.
Tomorrow, I don't want to give away too much of what's to come, but the way you kind of broke it up, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but today, of course, is the recruitment. Tomorrow, the second installment is sort of Joe getting to campus and winning the job. And then it's ultimately what transpired in part 3 over the last 2 years, culminating in a national championship. The thing that's probably going to pop the most in tomorrow's piece that's going to release is sort of for lack of a better word, Jeff, the drama leading up to Joe winning the job. How much of that was uncomfortable for the players, coaches, for Joe to relive?
It was not uncomfortable at all in any way that I could tell. I didn't know anything about that going into it. And, I always like to start. A lot of people think this is a disadvantage as a reporter. I see it actually as an advantage. I like to think of a blank sheet of paper or a blank notebook. And my goal is I don't want to go in there with preconceived notions. I want to learn what I'm learning. And so I didn't know about any of that stuff. I learned it all as I went. Everyone was incredibly open in talking to me about that. Now, I interviewed, as I said, 35 people for this story. Coach O and Joe were the last two. I wanted to find out as much as I could from everybody else, learn as much as I could, so that I would then know what it was that I wanted to talk to those two about, the central figures of the story. So by the time I got to them, I had a pretty good feel and a pretty good understanding of what went on behind the scenes in some of those situations. You referred to it as drama, and I think it really was. So Coach O referred to it as, black sky, skies falling down, black clouds. So it was an interesting period. That could have gone, one of two ways. He could have lost the team, or they could have rallied around him and believed in everything he was doing. And that's exactly the way it turned out. Mm-hmm. Rallying around him because of the way he handled it and believing in everything he was doing. And we all see how that turned out. But no, I knew nothing about it going in. Coach O was very open with me, talking to me about it when we sat down. And then Joe was the last person of the 35 I interviewed. I have a feeling he knew that I probably handle on some of that had already gone on. So maybe that was what made him more comfortable talking about it. I really can't answer that, but he was very open and comfortable talking about it.
Well, Jeff, it's obviously a testament to you and the job you do and helping people feel comfortable with the process you're going through to get so many people to openly talk about something that might be uncomfortable. And it helps, obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, knowing that this team went on to do amazing things. But the fascinating thing, reading it, and a lot of it's stuff I maybe knew surface level, but really digging into it the way you did, it was surprising even to me just how deep some of those factions got and just how tenuous that situation could have been and how they were able to come through it. Did you feel, and obviously the basis of the entire story is Joe and Ed and their relationship. It's not so much retelling stories of the football games, but did you get a sense as to when for Joe and Ed it really became, as you came to describe it at the end, like a father and son type relationship, like when they really got to that level with each other?
Yeah, well, I don't think there was any one moment. And I asked a lot of people about that during my research, including Joe and Coach O. And, the best I could tell and the way I pieced it together, it was really building blocks. It wasn't any one thing. So it might have been, the parking lot conversation as Coach O defined it as the beginning of trust. But that situation they got into where there was that debate, if you will, or even drama, the situation where it really looked like things were tough for a couple days when Justin McMillan transferred and Lowell Narcisse did as well. And there was that leadership committee meeting that Coach O held, and then the leaders left and held a players-only meeting. That was another huge building block because of the way Coach O handled that as such a good leader, because of the way Joe represented himself in that meeting, where all the leaders spoke first, and it wasn't until the end. Joe kept his mouth shut and listened, and it wasn't until the very end that he stood up and spoke for the first time. It was the first time he had ever spoken to the team as a whole. And so I think that was another big piece right there, that mutual trust and respect, how Coach O handled that, how Joe handled that. So there were a lot of things along the way. Some of the others are in the piece as well, but I just don't think you can define one single moment. At least no one could do that for me, and I saw it as a process of building blocks.
It is a 3-part series, the story of Joe Burrow and Ed Orgeron, forever linked. Part 1 is up right now at The Advocate, theadvocate.com. If you go to the sports page, it's right there on the homepage of the sports section. Part 2 tomorrow, Part 3 on Wednesday leading up to the draft. Any sort of what's next, Jeff, as a sort of a postscript to this story for any of the particulars, Joe and Ed Orgeron included?
Well, I would say for me, the most interesting thing that's going to come out of this, of course, I want to see what happens next year with Joe. I mean, that's, wherever he goes, it's going to be a challenging place for him. Obviously, it looks like it will be Cincinnati, but the more I learn about him, the more confidence I have in him that he can take any situation. And he's a guy that knows how to transform something from the negative to the positive in a pretty good way. Coach O, I have no doubt about, because of the kind of leader he's going to be, that this program is going to be in good shape for a long time to come. I think one of the most interesting pieces to watch for me on a personal level is going to be Myles Brennan. I know that has nothing to do with Joe. It has nothing to do with Coach O directly, but I was really, really impressed by Myles Brennan. I don't mean as a quarterback. I know nothing about him as a quarterback. I'm talking about the kind of young man he is. I spent some time with him, talking to him for this story. And that's a guy that was in a tough situation. Looking back on it, I would have thought that the choice that was being made was between Myles Brennan or Joe Burrow. But it turns out what I learned through this story, it was really, at least within the team, within the building, as they say, it was a lot more talk about a Justin camp and a Joe camp. But Myles Brennan has handled this all so well with so much class. He and Joe became very good friends. They ended up being roommates in the hotels, the nights before games. And talking to Myles, I was just so impressed with him as a young man, and it made me really want to see good things happen for him. So that's one of the postscripts I'm actually going to watch. I love the things Myles shared that became part of this story. I thought was really poignant and telling about not only Joe and O, but about Myles.
Well said. I was one of the lucky few, I guess, who got to read the entire thing in one sitting with my coffee on Saturday morning, Jeff. It was a long cup of coffee, but I did get to read it in its entirety. A job well done. And I'm going to speak for a lot of people and thanking you for taking the time to do this, because it's something that a lot of people who are going to forever cherish this season will have an opportunity to experience in a different way that so many people want to experience as much of this story as they can for a long time, and they'll be able to because of what you wrote.
Well, thank you. And normally, Matt, working on a long-term project such as this one, what you need to do is you need to avoid distractions. But in this case, the project actually became my distraction and a very enjoyable one because of the world we're living in right now, because of all the craziness, because of all the drama, because of all the anxiety. This really became for me the last month or so as I was really deep into my writing process. It became a wonderful distraction for me. And I actually thank Joe for this gift, the gift of being able to be distracted and work on this story. So I hope people enjoy reading it as much as I enjoyed the process. And my goal was to have something that would be archived for a long time and people could enjoy. So I hope that's what it turns into. Thank you.
Success. Make sure you follow Jeff on Twitter at LSU Tigers Book. He is Jeff Marx. Thanks as always. We appreciate you.
Thanks, Matt.